Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about future of science and technology. I have to say I'm a little late starting here because I was just working on building a piece of future of technology, at least. I'm excited today because we are in the process of in the late stages of bringing out a new product that is looking even more promising than I expected. So that's uh, that's an exciting thing, and it's kind of AI related. I see we have a bunch of questions here about AI, so maybe we can start with some of those. Um, well, actually, this is one not. Well, there's one from Noah here. Do you think AI will ever actually understand things like humans do? I think it's a very hard kind of philosophical question to address because it's kind of like we all have an internal experience of that about we have a sort of internal experience, but it's only by extrapolation that we know what anybody else's internal experience is. So if I say, I feel I understand that, we can, there's a certain internal experience that I have, but operationally, it's like, well, let me test whether you or another person understands that. You only see it from the outside. Will it be the case that sort of AIs can show the effects of understanding the way that we humans do? Sure. Will it be if we say, what's that little kind of spark of understanding that's going on inside? Well, I don't think that's kind of something we can disentangle for us humans or for the AIs. It's a question of our individual internal experience. I mean, if we say, let's monitor every neuron in a brain, where was it that that spark of understanding happened? We're not going to find that any more than monitoring every value in some neural net or something is going to say that's the value that was the understanding, the spark, the moment of understanding. It's not the way these things work. In fact, some recent things I've done trying to understand the foundations of machine learning really very much kind of highlight the extent to which that's not how things work. When machine learning learns something, and it's probably the same in brains, what it's doing is it's taking some sort of lump of what's computationally possible. It may be something that's really pretty complicated and sort of an elaborate structure that was built according to some computational rules. And it's saying, well, I can fit that elaborate structure to be a piece of this thing that allows me to do some particular task. My analogy recently has been, you're building a wall and you're making a stone wall and you're picking up these random rocks that are different shapes and they happen to fit together to make the stone wall. That's, I think, the way that sort of quotes understanding. That's the way of what happens inside machine learning. It's probably the way for what happens inside brains and neuroscience. And it's something where there isn't a spark of understanding there. It's, oh, you put these sort of misshapen rocks together, and the result was you could do certain kinds of thinking, which from the outside, you would say, well, if I were doing that, I would feel like I had understanding on the inside. That's how I think one should think about this. I see another question from Noah here. Do you think we'll ever understand everything about the universe, or will there always be mysteries? One of the things that's come out of a bunch of science I've done is this idea of what I call computational irreducibility. Even when you know the rules by which a system is made, you may have to do a sort of irreducible amount of computational work, just sort of following through the steps of what the system does to find out what it will do. And sort of the consequence of computational irreducibility, one of its consequences is there'll always be surprises. As you run the system, it will go step by step and do what it does, but you'll never be able to systematically jump ahead and say, oh, I know everything it's going to do. You'll always have to just wait and see what it does. And there'll be things that it does that you can't readily anticipate. Now, a flip side of that is that within any computationally irreducible system, there are always an infinite number of kind of pockets of computational reducibility, little places where you can jump ahead on specific kinds of things. You can say, well, I don't know, there's some pattern of black and white pixels or something. I don't know the details of what will come out, but at least every time I see a line of white that's long enough, it's going to decay as some kind of triangle of white as it goes further forward. That's a piece of reducibility, a kind of little pocket of reducibility where we can make at least a short-term prediction. And so what we can expect is that within sort of the computational irreducibility of many things, there will always be these pockets of reducibility. There will always be discoveries that can be made, inventions that can be made, ways to take that underlying computational irreducibility and do things where we can anticipate what will happen, where we can say, we found this neat thing that we can use for some technological purpose because we can see how it's going to work out in that particular case. So the answer, I think, is that there will always be inventions to be made. There will always be discoveries to be made. There will always be things where there is a little place where we can jump ahead and we can say something. Now, the other question is in science, for example, there's sort of been this long-running issue of, can we figure out all of how the universe works? You know, can we drill down and see what's the lowest level machine code of the universe? And people, you know, 300 years ago or so, 400 years ago, people were pretty optimistic that you'd be able to do that. That it's kind of like, well, we've got all these methods and math and so on. We're just going to nail it. We're going to say, this is how the universe works, period, end of story. At least specifying its rules at the lowest level. But then over a series of few centuries, it's like, well, we got this, we understand how mechanics works, but then we realize that there's relativity, and then we realize that there are atoms, and we realize there's quantum mechanics and so on. And it always seemed like as soon as you turn over another rock, so to speak, there's more stuff to learn about physics, for instance. And I suppose that there was sort of some enthusiasm, probably going into the 1980s and 1990s. Oh, we're almost there. You know, we've almost managed to get with, I don't know, string theory or some other thing. We've almost managed to sort of nail how the universe is put together. I think finally, last few years with our Wolfram Physics Project effort, we actually do know kind of what the lowest level machine code of the universe is like. And it's really a very surprising thing. I mean, it's something I would not have been able to predict. Could have happened in my lifetime for sure. I couldn't have picked which century we'd get to this point, or whether in fact there might be a possibility that it's sort of turtles all the way down, that there's no bottom to the whole thing. But in fact, what seems to be the case is that we actually now have an understanding of what kind of the lowest level machine code of the universe is like. Now, you might say, okay, so then we're done with science. Well, no, not at all. This is where computational irreducibility comes in. Even though we might know the lowest level rules by which the universe operates, that when it comes to things that are of relevance to us at the scale we're at and so on, there is this irreducible computational effort that needs to be gone through to work that out. In fact, that computational effort is something the universe does, but we're not going to be able to outrun the universe to do that any faster than the universe does it. But we can hope that there are these pockets of computational reducibility, particular kinds of things about which we can make statements. In fact, our standard physical laws, our standard natural laws, are examples of pockets of reducibility that we have found that allow us to make statements that don't require us to do the amount of computational work that it takes the universe to do what the universe does. So we can expect, for very sort of deep theoretical reasons, we can expect that we're going to go on finding these pockets of reducibility. We're going to go on finding things that we can say about the universe that we didn't think we were able to say. We're going to be able to go on finding sort of hacks in the universe that let us build technology on the basis of what exists in the universe that we didn't expect were there. So the answer is that while we may have gotten to the bottom of things in terms of what the underlying rules look like, that doesn't mean we're finished with all of science and technology. Far from it. There's sort of an infinite frontier of science and technology. In fact, the main challenge is just in the space of all possible pieces of technology, for example, which ones do we care about inventing? In other words, we could imagine all sorts of funky technology that allows you to, I don't know what, have, I don't know, some strange drone that kind of goes and climbs trees and does this and that. But is it something we care about? There's sort of an infinite amount that is inventable, and there's a question of sort of how we humans navigate the set of things that we want to do to decide whether that thing is worth inventing. I mean, we could imagine something which, makes images that are sort of random arrays of pixels that swirl around in particular patterns, which perhaps right now we just don't care about. But maybe sometime in the future we'll discover, oh, actually, that's a great sort of source of relaxation, or a great way to sort of think about some new style of art. And then we'll start caring about that sort of corner of what's possible. Let's see. Question from Lorenzo here. If there are aliens, they probably have AI, right? Well, that's a mess, really, because the thing to understand is that sort of this notion of intelligence sort of is something that is much more ubiquitous than we might have imagined. We know about human minds, we know about brains and so on. But the fact is that if we say, what is the computational process? What is the essential thing that is being achieved by a brain, by a human mind? The answer is it's something computational. But that computational thing we're seeing now, lots of it can be done with artificial neural nets and AI. And also something that I've long discussed, those sort of computational outcomes can also be achieved by things in nature that seem very non-mind-like. Favorite example being the weather, which is sometimes said kind of metaphorically to have a mind of its own. But the fact is that the kind of microscopic processes of motion of fluids and air and clouds and all this kind of thing, that is the same kind of level of computational sophistication as the stuff that's going on in our brains. The issue is that that kind of computation that's going on in the weather, for example, is not really aligned with the way we humans think about things. We can't sort of discuss very meaningfully what's the purpose of the weather. What's the weather? Maybe we can say, what's the weather trying to achieve? It's trying to mix this hot air with cold air in some place in the atmosphere or something. Just like we might look at a human and say, that human is, trying to be successful as a such and such. We can attribute purposes perhaps there as well, but there's a lot of, the weather doesn't get to, enjoy a fine piece of chocolate or something as we humans might. And so, there's not an alignment between its form of sort of computational intelligence and ours. But so when we talk about aliens, there's sort of intelligence all around us in the universe. And I think it's this question of sort of how human-like is it? Well, the alignment of kind of the aliens, do they have, are they playing Scrabble or something? That's we don't really expect that level of alignment. We expect that but the question is it closer than the mind that the weather has? Or is it something that is sort of perhaps intermediate between that and something that plays Scrabble or whatever? And I think that this question about sort of what the AI is an example of kind of an alien mind. It is a mind-like thing created in a substrate that is not, that has certain sort of algorithmic similarity probably to brains, but is sort of hardware, in terms of hardware, rather different. So I think it's sort of it's not really a meaningful question, because I think that sort of the aliens, there's this whole spectrum of alien intelligences, from AIs quite aligned with human intelligences to things like the weather that aren't. Let's see, the questions here. Gosh. Question here from Tig. Do you think that the aging process is something programmed the same way as the developmental process, or do we just have wear and tear more like a car or something else? It's an interesting question. My guess is it's a mixture. My guess is that there is wear and tear. Nature has found ways to repair some of that wear and tear. But in the process of biological evolution, the motivation, so to speak, and we talk about that sort of anthropomorphically, so to speak, the motivation of evolution has not necessarily been to extend lifespans uh, that greatly. And so the mechanisms that the sort of developmental mechanisms and so on are ones which just sort of they you can read them as, oh, there's just going to be a finite lifetime. Now, one of the things that we kind of learn from computers is when things go wrong with a computer, the best thing to do is reboot it. Biology discovered the same thing. When things go wrong with an organism, the best thing to do is just have a new organism and, have successive generations. There may be primitive organisms that really, as an individual organism, live a really long time. There's certainly things in several parts of the sort of life where sort of a single organism buds off other things which aren't necessarily, which you might think of as not really being different organisms. They're part of the same sort of collective organism. Sort of interesting to think about. What would that be like if humans worked that way? If instead of sort of there being a distinct kind of human with a new, separate, fresh mind that exists at every generation, if we humans were more like, the plants that send out runners and sort of make another piece of plant that comes up somewhere else, if we were somehow more like that, and there was something where, brains kind of progressively, every so often brains would bud off a piece of brain and that would become the new human. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about because it certainly seems like, although there are particular structures in the brain that are localized for particular purposes, the general sort of memory we have and things like this is not well localized in the brain, just as it's not well localized in neural networks and so on when we're doing machine learning. It's something, and so one could imagine if it was like, oh, we're going to, the brain of the not human, so to speak, is such that, after some number of years, a piece buds off and that eventually becomes a new human who's kind of had, who has gotten not just the genetic material, but also the mind and the memory of the previous human. But that's not how we humans work. So the question is, what are the things that, for example, lead to aging? We can see sort of operationally the things that happen, whether it's oxidative processes of oxidation, which are kind of like just things are burning up. And, there's damage to cells as a result of that. There's genetic damage as we replicate our cells to produce new cells. It looked for a while as if there was sort of a definitive limit. 50 replications was all you got. And then it was like, well, those are associated with the telomeres, the end caps for pieces of DNA that might start as, 50 units of end cap. And then every time there's a replication, you lose a unit of end cap. Clearly, when you get the replication for the things that are going to turn into kind of the egg cells and so on, you have a different plan because you're then feeding in, putting more telomeres in there for the next generation. It's going to start with its 50 and so on. But actually, as usual in biology, the story is more complicated than that. And there's, telomerase and the things which can add telomeres. And it's kind of like, well, if you eat right, you might add telomeres type thing. It's a more complicated story than just this pure, you've got this supply of telomeres and that's your kind of clock counting down how many replications you can make, and then it's over, so to speak. I mean, people make a lot out of damage to mitochondria, the energy source for our cells. People talk about genetic damage and so on. And it's very unclear what, there are particular subsystems that show signs of wear, but there also are clearly known mechanisms to reverse those signs of wear, at least for that particular subsystem. Now, it could be the case that there is sort of some tendency of a carefully organized, orchestrated system, as we humans are as living organisms, that there is a tendency over time for enough things to go wrong that eventually the thing fails completely. And we certainly see a similar phenomenon in computer operating systems. For example, you're running a server and it's running along happily, and something goes wrong, and some memory buffer was incorrectly did this or that, or some interrupt came in at just the wrong time and something went slightly wrong, or some other, lots of kinds of things like that that are more at the level of the operation, the software operation of the thing, than they are at the level of a bit got flipped somewhere in a piece of RAM. So it's possibly the case that there's sort of a pretty global feature of kind of bulk orchestrated systems, of which computer operating systems are one example. We humans and life are sort of another example. It could be the case that there is some kind of fundamental tendency of such systems to have something that's like aging. And we certainly see that with computer operating systems. Things go wrong, and they get old and tired, and eventually they crash. And then we have to restart them, like the next generation, so to speak, restarted from the same genetic material, or the same program in that case. So it's quite possible that there's a sort of principle of organization that is sort of that leads to things like aging that we don't yet know. And when we look at kind of sort of fixing aging, then what we can look at are individual things that produce catastrophic results. And we can say, let's fix that individual thing. Let's fix, in the computer case, it will be let's, fix some kind of buffer overflow issue or something like this. Okay, we know how to fix it. We've got, in the human case, it might be we've got some procedure, some drug, whatever, that can fix that. And then we deal with that particular sort of cause of aging. But the question is sort of what can we say about the aggregate of all those things? Now, from the point of view of biological evolution, biological evolution is not particularly motivated to solve the aging problem. In other words, if we say just the sort of the processes of natural selection and so on, once you've had kids, in a first approximation, you're old news. Maybe there's a dynamic where the grandparents are important too. I don't know. And evolution has a habit of sort of finding these kinds of features. But in terms of just the pure sort of mathematical mechanics of biological evolution, when it comes to make more copies of that genetic program, you've done your thing when you had your kids, so to speak. And so you then can say, well, maybe in the biological case, if you're it's like if you're a plant or something, eventually things are going to get overcrowded. If there's a bunch of old plants hanging around, you might as well have the old plants die and make room for the young, fresh, new plants to come up. And I think that's how general that is sort of ecologically in biology. I suspect it's fairly general. I mean, if you're a hunting animal and you've got a certain territory that you can hunt, and you're essentially going to be competing with your kids, but you're kind of getting slower and slower, and your kids are going to be able to be much more efficient hunters, then eventually kind of cede the territory to the kids, so to speak. So, I think biological evolution doesn't have the motivation to extend lifespans, even though from the point of view of, let's say, the individual human, it's like, hey, I'm having a good time. Let's extend lifespan as much as we can. I think there's this sort of question of what's the right way to do that? And, there are many different efforts of kind of, it was discovered a few years ago how to revert cells to be stem cells and that happens, it's fairly reliable. There may be some genetic instability when you've reverted a cell to become a stem cell that can differentiate it into all the other kinds of cells. It might be that it still retains some trace of its origins, and it might be that the kind of genetics of the cells that get produced have some instability, which might lead to, cancer or something like this. But in a first approximation, kind of the trick got found to take any old cell we have and revert it to being kind of a fresh start, next generation type cell, but with identical genetic material to the individual. And that means that there is the potential, although it's a lot of work to figure out how to guide cells into particular differentiation pathways. Only a couple of dozen, I think, have been done so far, and they're very elaborate procedures. And to guide them into all the different tissues that we have, to figure out how to make the right scaffolding to actually construct a tissue of this or that kind. And, I think that things like, okay, we can make replacement parts. That's one kind of approach to kind of extending lifespan and things like this. But there's sort of a question of, is there a more global thing where eventually it's kind of, here's the elixir of eternal youth? You might say, if you can get cells to kind of sort of rejuvenate by being part of, by being, uh, by going back to stem cells, well, why don't you just do that? Well, the reason is, well, you don't want to turn yourself into a bunch of stem cells. That's sort of a formula for just having tumors everywhere, so to speak. You have the cells that you have, and you want them to be happy, healthy heart cells, lung cells, brain cells, whatever else, not to revert back to being stem cells again. But there are all sorts of things where I mentioned before this kind of the computational irreducibility and infinite pockets of reducibility. We, as biological organisms, seem to be full of computational irreducibility and full of ways in which we put together those pieces of irreducibility to make things that operate as the biological organisms that we are. And I think that this question of kind of, there's an infinite number of hacks to be found that allow one to make the organism continue working, work better, and so on. And medicine has found some of those. There are surely infinitely more to find. And there are also cases where you're kind of doing things, but you don't really know why it works. That's a lot of what happens in medicine. But you happen to find it does work. I mean, one of the ones that's been a persistent story for years and years and years is the kind of take blood from the young you and put it into the older you, and that will somehow make you younger. I think the experimental evidence is kind of still a bit questionable on that. But every so often people will say, well, by the way, didn't you know that this kind of cell, this kind of immune system cell or something, it just has this natural tendency as it gets older to become less efficient. And if you just put in some fresh ones from before, now maybe there's a way to revert older ones to be like the fresher ones from before, then it will make your immune system bigger, better, whatever. There are things like that we don't necessarily understand why they work, but they might just work. I think that this whole question of sort of, can you kind of sort of prevent all the leaks to lead to sort of continued kind of health and lifespan, or will there just be an infinite number of leaks, just as there are sort of these infinite different things that happen with computational irreducibility? Will there always be leaks, or is there some kind of global solution that lets one have kind of what in the past was kind of the philosopher's stone, elixir of eternal youth type thing? People have certainly wondered if such a thing might exist for a long time. I don't think we can prove that it doesn't. And we can certainly see other organisms that have all kinds of characteristics of, look at the cool shark that has this very special feature. And if we could just have that in humans, then we would live happily ever after, so to speak. But just how to arrange all those things is very unclear. I think this question about whether there is a kind of a clock that runs down for us humans and then we die type thing, there certainly are pieces of that are there. I mean, there's certainly a certain rhythm of life. One of the things that always shocks me is that things that do facial feature identification, like we have that in Wolfram language, the facial features function, it'll tell you, what's things about a face that it sees. And among other things, it tells you the age of the face. And I've always been sort of suspicious that maybe it was trained on my face or something, and that's why it knows my age to within a very small number of years. But that isn't what's going on. What happens is that there are sort of changes of bone structure and things that just happen to all of us as we age, and they're kind of it's a long running clock. Just like when we're kids, we kind of grow in certain somewhat predetermined ways. I mean, you can have a growth spurt when you're 12 or something, or you can not, or you can have there are different details of how that works. But overall, there's a definite pattern. There's definite growth curves for humans. And it turns out that there are processes that go on like that. I mean, when it comes to sort of things like, I don't know, the plates of the skull fuse in one's 40s, things like this. And there are just other things that are sort of a bit clock-like in us humans. And that makes it seem as if evolution has is sort of giving us a countdown clock. I think that's probably not what's happened. I think what's probably happened is that there are many trade-offs about, should you have things that energetically produce new cells? Well, there's a risk of producing a tumor if you do that. And the sort of that evolution has found compromises between these things, but because of the thing I mentioned, namely that doesn't have selection pressure to extend lifespan, it finds those compromises that work for some number of years, for enough years to matter, and then it's not bothering to find compromises that work longer. So, I think it would be an interesting thing if it was the case that sort of centenarians, so to speak, that their genetics were sort of harvested for another generation. It might be the case that after a while, that would be something, there would be natural selection that would favor making it to the age of 100. But there's no dynamic for that right now in the way that natural selection has worked. And natural selection on humans is something that has really changed its character because we have so many medical things we can do, and there are lots of things that would have been like, well, sorry, that with that genetic makeup you're not going to make it. Actually, now you can make it just fine, so that's really changed the nature of natural selection for humans. And obviously, the sort of the efforts of 100 years ago to go for artificial selections for humans were a super bad idea that have been sort of cast out of the possibility space, and for good reason. But I think, although how that will come back as there is more potential for kind of choose the genetics of your children, that's a different issue, and that's its own separate question. Let's see. I'm looking for different questions. Oh gosh, so many questions here. Rogue is commenting on a game that I don't know, which revolves around the idea of digital consciousness. Do you think humans being able to digitize their mind or their soul will be beneficial to our progression? Well, depends what you mean by our. It's an interesting question of both ethics and kind of, in a sense, philosophy of mind. If you have a digital copy of yourself, to what extent is it the same you? And for example, if you went to sleep one day and while you're asleep, your brain is taken over by digital electronics, and when you wake up, it's actually a digital you that's waking up. How do you think about that? Because your memory, your you-ness is very much connected to your memory of the you-ness in the past. And it's, if you have kind of a digital copy of yourself, how does that work? Because the digital copy might have that exact same memory of the past of you, but to what extent is the digital copy the same as the current you? So, for example, if you imagine the situation where, your brain is scanned and you've got this digital version of yourself, and you meet the digital version of yourself, and maybe it's also got a body and it's had molecular copies made of everything, and it's kind of the you with kind of the budded off mind of the same as what you had. It's like, I wonder how you feel about that. It's kind of, do you feel like, well, my job is done if I might as well disappear because the digital me is now going to take over, and that's all good. But you kind of feel like the jump of your experience to the digital you isn't going to happen because you're still feeling your internal experience, your thread of experience, And while you can see the digital you and see that the digital you is having the same, you can infer that the digital you has the same thread of experience that you have, but it isn't your one. And so it's kind of you, to the outside world, it might be the case that, you die off and the digital you takes over, and there's really no difference. It's kind of like you were replaced by the android, so to speak, and everybody around you is like, oh, it's the same you. But to you internally, one has the impression that one would, I mean, it's a very strange thing because if one has one's thread of consciousness and it ends, effectively that one is stopped. Effectively, that consciousness dies. And there's another one that takes over, and it's sort of identical, starting from the same place. To anybody on the outside, it just looks like you went on. But to you internally, you feel that it would feel as if you ended. But actually, it wouldn't feel like anything, because if you've ended, there's nothing to feel. So it's a bit of a sort of it's a complicated conundrum of how you anticipate that, what it means, how that whole process works. And obviously in the actuality of things, it might be the case that you have the biological brain and you're gradually replacing pieces of it with digital electronics or whatever. And for you still feel like it's a single thread of consciousness, and there are pieces being taken over, and you don't really notice that. It's just like if you're, if you, it would be, it's just like an extension of you, and it feels like you, so to speak. And at some moment you might realize, oh, none of the biological tissue is left, but that transition happened gradually enough that that thread of consciousness was sort of moved over. Now, I mean, the issue is it beneficial to our progression to sort of be digital? Well, the question is, what's the hour here? I mean, there will come a time when real decisions have to be made. Do we actually, are we kind of humanity first, or are we minds first? And one can certainly imagine a situation where sort of minds are quite separate from the specifics of humans. And, one could start saying, okay, let's send our digitized minds out, colonizing the galaxy or who knows what else. That becomes realistic in that case. It's not so realistic for biological humans, not really realistic at all. But how does one feel about that? For example, if we think about ethics, a very human concept, is our responsibility, do we feel our ethical responsibility is to the preservation of humans as humanity, or to the preservation of effectively the minds and souls of humans, which is a separate issue? And those things have not, so far in human history, those have not diverged. I mean, there are certainly religious belief systems that have those diverge, but in sort of everyday practical life, those don't really diverge. But with sort of digital consciousness, those will diverge. And so there will come a moment, perhaps, when one says, well, are we promoting the humans, or are we promoting the engrams of human minds? And I don't think there's an ethical basis for talking about that, because ethics is so grounded in, it really doesn't have an abstract meaning. It's something that is grounded in the actualities of us humans, our history, our society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's something where I don't think you can sort of disembodiedly say I was going to say in the God's eye view, but that's a more complicated concept in its own right in sort of theological thought. But from sort of there isn't an external abstract formal point of view in which you can say, well, actually, the digital minds it is as ethically, it makes as much sense ethically to promote those as it does to promote, humanity and sort of the human condition in its biological form. So I think it could very well be the case that if your goal is sort of understand what I would now call the Rulliad, the space of all possible computational processes, if your goal is to explore as much of the Ruliad as possible, your goal might be explore as much physical space as possible. Your goal might be quite different. If your goal is explore as much of the sort of computational universe as possible, then by all means, having digital minds is going to be more effective at that. But it's hard to believe that that's what, as a human collective society, that's probably not what our ethical objective is, or I don't know whether we should say should be, because there's no should here. It's that's not what it is, and so I think it's a very complicated thing to imagine. I don't think there's an answer. I think the answer is that it's kind of what we choose it to be, and if the we shifts, it's like, well, we humans as we are right now choose this, but then there are humans that are different from us, and we say, well, for example, let's say there are humans where there's very little biological mind. It's mostly digital mind. And the digital mind humans start saying, well, in our ethics, we think digital minds are the right thing, and that's where everything should be going. And the fact that there's this cost to having biological minds because they eat lots of food or whatever else, we don't want that. That's not really ethically something that we care about. But now what's happened there is one's shifted sort of the base of ethics from humans as we are today to those digital minds. And when we've shifted the base of ethics, we have nothing to say about that. I mean, we could imagine, the ethics of whales, let's say, and whales might have their own internal ethics, but that's something that is not connected to our human ethics. And we're not going to be able to say, look, I don't think whales should be, well, they don't eat their young, but doing whatever it is that whales do that we don't approve of, so to speak. But that's a very strange thing to try and take our human ethics built in our sort of human context and apply it to something different. And by the time we are sort of, the digital minds just won't have the same, they don't have the same connection. They don't have the same sort of base for ethics that they would have. Let's see. I see a couple of questions here. One from Rando saying they've been processing semi-corrupt data from 50-year-old magnetic tapes and having to decide the best way to handle various types of corruption. What are your thoughts on the present and future information data storage and preservation, given the volume and the saying humidity and mold that threatens modern digital storage? Yeah, it's a complicated thing. I've had this experience too. I have tapes, magnetic tapes that I made in the late 1970s, and some of them we've had a hell of a time reading. We actually failed recently. I had a floppy disk that was an 8-inch floppy disk. So most commonly there were 5.25 and 3.5-inch floppy disks, but I had from a very peculiar early workstation computer from the early 1980s, I had an 8-inch floppy disk, and we tried valiantly to read it and we couldn't. So what people imagine is that these magnetic media, they're little pieces of ferrite, and the magnetism, the local magnetism, will diffuse over the course of decades, and they will become unreadable. My own experience in sort of data preservation is, if it's online, if it's something where there's a living, breathing version of that data that can be copied into another living, breathing version, then it lives on. And it's becoming easier and easier to do that because the cost of even spinning disk storage or solid state storage and so on is coming down to the point where you can store an awful lot of stuff really quite cheaply. And I think that's the way to really preserve things, is to always keep it online, to never have it go into a kind of an inert storage medium. Now, there are more extreme versions of the inert storage medium. You can sort of try and put it on a DNA molecule. I don't know how well that works, because the oldest DNA molecules that we have are maybe a few million years old. I don't think they're older than that. The sort of science fiction concept of the mosquito that sucked the dinosaur's blood and was preserved in a piece of amber, and we extract its DNA. I don't think that's reality. I think that DNA is at a molecular scale, everything is quite fragile. DNA is a lot less fragile than many things. Certainly, RNA is vastly more fragile, but it's still at the scale of a molecule, we really can't expect it to last millions of years. And I think the as a high information density molecule, and there are things people do. I don't know. There's a friend of mine who likes to send different sort of kind of beacons of our civilization out into the solar system, and has been etching things in little pieces of quartz. And I don't know how long those last. I have another friend who was built some of the equipment for the Planck satellite, which is at one of the Lagrange points in the Earth, Moon, Sun system, and I think his signature is on there. And he's proud of the fact that it'll last 1 billion years, and that's just a piece of it's a piece of metal basically. And that's something where you've etched into a piece of metal. I don't know what the scale is. I don't know if you take a microprocessor. I don't know. I'm guessing that the etching of a microprocessor is really pretty stable. I mean, you're etching a piece of silicon, and I don't think there are diffusion processes that happen over any kind of short time scale. I mean, I'm kind of guessing that the microprocessor that we have today will be, in 1 million years, you'd still be able to read down to the few nanometer scale of the microprocessor. I think, I'm not sure. That's a question of how fast diffusion processes kind of cause the atoms to jiggle around. And that depends a bit on the temperature. But I think that the kind of atomic forces are large enough to probably, in any kind of room temperature, so to speak, that it's going to be okay. Clearly, if you heat the thing up to the point where it melts, all bets are off. And somewhere intermediate between kind of current room temperature and melting, things are going to start failing on a shorter time scale. But I would say, in terms of what is preserved, what is readable, I think one of the things that's interesting, sort of the archaeology of the future is likely to be able to read more engrams, more, I would say, tea leaves, more kind of detailed molecular things that have happened than we have in the past. And certainly, a thing I've long suspected is that any solid surface that has had mechanical things happen to it, whether it's typing on keys or whether it's doing being rattled around in some way or another, that at an atomic scale, there will ultimately be a way to read out what happened to that thing. And there are just an awful lot of atoms in a little region of some solid surface. The thing that's interesting to realize is that atoms are small enough that all the things that we've produced, all the videos we produce and all of these kinds of things, those represent a pretty small number of atoms. They are, it's perfectly possible to have a thing that's pretty small that has enough atoms that, in principle, if you could store things at an atomic scale, it can store things that are huge compared to our human output or our human sensory input, so to speak. So it's kind of a scale thing that a small bottle of atoms is enough to store everything that every scene that's been observed in human history, for example. And I think that's that is an interesting phenomenon of the fact that we are sort of observers at the scale we're at, that there are things at microscopic scales in the actual universe, as the universe is, that can cover sort of everything we observe very easily. Those are things to consider. But I would say, as a really practical matter, and relates to this as well, if you want things to be preserved, keep them in online storage and expect to copy them, and expect it to be the case that it's the kind of the soul of the machine that survives. That is the kind of the abstract engram of its computational content, not, I ran it on this disk drive, then it's on this disk drive. I mean, for example, the data that I have no idea whether the particulars of the disk drive it's on have certainly changed over time. When you have a RAID disk array, for example, and one of the disks fails, a little red light comes on, you pull that disk out, you stick another one in, things start to get copied onto that disk. It's, the actuality, the particular, pieces of ferrite that were on that disk are no longer what's storing your data. What matters is the kind of preservation of the kind of digital essence of your data. And that's something that I think is sort of the way to move these things into the future. Let's see. Primo comments, if the parts of the brain are removed in stages and digital implants are properly synced with the remaining brain, wouldn't that solve the problem of is it me or not? Yes, I think it would. I think that the sort of the gradualness of kind of the turnover of that material will mean that one can feel it's you. Now, I mean, it's worth remembering that our bodies, turn over their content over the course of months to years to decades, and we're still pretty sure it's us, even though, those particular skin cells, they'll be gone in weeks. And, okay, brain cells last a lot longer, and some seem to last a lifetime. But there's still lots of turnover in in our bodies, and we're still pretty sure it's us. Let's see. There's the questions about preservation of things, and clearly biological tissue is one of the areas where it's kind of like, can you preserve it? And particularly when there's things about it where we don't even know what's stored and where and so on. Human memories, for example, we're pretty sure those are, I don't know, calcium channels and synapses between nerve cells and so on in the brain. And we're pretty sure that, if you could look carefully enough at every synapse, you'd be able to see with an electron microscope, you might be able to see little pores and so on. And somehow all those things put together are like kind of the weights of a neural net, and they make us have the memories we have. We're pretty sure we know sort of physically how that works. It's not obvious it's how it works. It could be the case that memories are stored on molecules, for example, and that we're doing something a little bit like the kind of nanopore technology where we're pulling molecules through little holes, and we're seeing kind of electrical signals as the molecule gets pulled through the hole, and that memory works that way. We don't really know. I think the likelihood is, and the thing that artificial neural nets have kind of showed us, the likelihood is it's kind of the most obvious thing. It's kind of just these things like pores in synapses and so on that are the seat of memory. But, there's the question when you have biological tissue, can you preserve it with all of the things we don't understand about it, all of the sort of organization at the level of molecular biology and so on, with all those molecules doing all their complicated things which we don't yet understand? Can you, for example, do cryonics, just freeze it and start it back up again? My strong belief is that there will just be a way to do that. And it's one of these things that's like a sort of pocket of reducibility. We didn't yet find the perfect cryoprotectant, the perfect procedure for sort of cooling down molecules so that all activity stops and we can just preserve them for the future. But that's something I'm sort of hoping that will be a thing that is kind of outright discovered one day, just like mammalian cloning, just like the sort of reversion to stem cells and so on, just like the blue LED, just like lots of other kind of just outright inventions / discoveries in the world. And, certainly in terms of sort of it'll have an interesting societal impact of, have a pause. I'm just going to be frozen for the next 25 years, and then let me see what happens after that type thing. It's sort of an interesting thing to imagine, what the choices are that would say, well, things are bad now, but I'm pretty sure they're going to be better in 20 years. So let me go on pause for 20 years, so to speak. And it certainly affects, well, lots of kinds of things. If you're interested in kind of sending out, humans out into the cosmos, many technical issues with that. But having humans live for many generations in a starship is pretty unrealistic. Having sort of the frozen humans be there for a few hundred years, maybe it's much more realistic. Not completely clear what the point is then. What does it actually mean other than pure sort of ego for the species of, yes, we started on this one planet, we managed to, populate a bunch of other planets. Okay, that's cool, but I don't know. It's a sort of a question of, I'm not sure it's ethics, because I think ethics is in the context of the way we lead our lives today, so to speak. I'm not sure that there's a way to discuss that. I mean, for example, we could say we have an ethical belief, but this is a complicated issue. We have an ethical belief that we shouldn't mess up the rest of the universe. We shouldn't impose ourselves. We should have humility relative to the rest of the universe and not impose ourselves on it. In other words, if we had the opportunity to terraform Mars or something, we shouldn't do it because it's destroying something that is already there. And people might say, but it's only ethically bad if there's a mind there or something. But then you're sort of thrown into this principle of computational equivalence and lots of other issues about, what really is a mind? Is it, if we destroy the kind of the processes going on in the soil on Mars that are not processes that are just like life on Earth, not processes that are just like what are going on in brains, but they're these complicated processes and they've been going for 1 billion years, and we just come and kaboom, we blow them up. Is that ethically okay? Clearly, for us to even exist, even on the Earth, it's, we are constantly doing things where we are changing things. Our very existence changes things. And there's sort of a question of is there some global responsibility to the universe that we shouldn't change it too much? Or is there some kind of thing where we say, well, we're here for us and we're going to do what we need to do what's relevant to us, so to speak. And I think that's it's kind of like saying, let's not, we should kill nothing. Well, what about the bacteria that infect us, which we kill with antibiotics? Or what about things where that life cycle of the organism and the microbiome is such that this will happen to it just by the nature of how we operate? So I think it's an interesting kind of thing to discuss. But I have to say, I think in the end, we have to just say, in some sense, either we have to say, well, we are limited, our egotistical species should have sort of a box around its ego, or we say it's all for us, and we're thinking about ethics in terms of us. But even when we say, let's put a box around the ego of the species, a lot of that is about how we feel about doing that. There's no foundational principle that says we should do that. There's no foundational principle that says, for example, that the best thing we can do with the earth is leave it as we found it, so to speak. I don't think that's something which has to do with our feeling about what's the right thing to do, but it's a feeling inside us. It's not something where the universe intrinsically tells us, leave the earth as you found it, so to speak. So let me see. Okay, I probably need to go soon, but Weasel is asking, I wonder how hungry you would be after waking up after being frozen for 500 years. Well, my guess is, I mean, if one's frozen, then all metabolic activity has stopped. One will be somehow there won't be any, one had no need for food in that time, so to speak. It is, however, a physiological fact that most of the time when you sort of wake up from being very not there, you tend to have lots of nausea for reasons that have to do with, well, I guess it's various kinds of mismatches between the signals from your body, the signals from your brain, and so on. But so I bet that would happen if you could have cryonics and you could sort of warm the thing back up in the right way. I bet you'd have cryonic nausea when you woke up again. But I don't think you wouldn't be. Food will not be the issue. I mean, I think it's a very questionable thing if you ask yourself, what would it be like to come from 500 years ago and be put into today's world? And one of the things that is certainly the case is that throughout human history, the things that we humans have thought were important have changed a lot. And sort of from 500 years ago to today, it's like you wake up and a lot of the things that you cared about and you thought were important in life, the world, and so on, are irrelevant today. And maybe there's a sort of anachronistic part of society that says it's just the same as 500 years ago, and maybe that's where you like to hang out because it's kind of like a continuation of your life from 500 years ago. But it's something where I do think that there's a certain sense in which we are formed in a certain time, and it's not clear how well we fit in a different time. And that's we grow up and are educated and have our experiences in a certain time in history, and it's and that's and it's not clear we can move out of that. Um, I think I probably have to go in a moment here, but maybe we have one more question here. Uh, it's an acronym I don't know. GITS. What is that acronym? I don't know what that is. Um, uh, let me see. I don't think any of these questions are going to be short. Oh, there's one here which is sort of fun. Let me try and address this very quickly. From Ilux, do we know if all human thinking works the same way? I think no. I think that even between two LLMs, large language models, AIs, I think if you were to sort of take them apart and say, how did it come to that conclusion? Certainly the details of what the values are in the neural net will be different. Now, if we ask, are they thinking even roughly the same way? If we could have a higher level description, which may be very hard to get, of the thinking process, will those things align? I mean, it's kind of like when, when you're trying to solve some problem, I don't know, a kid solving some school problem, school math problem or something, different people think different ways about those things. And that's probably, as I've tried to study sort of the foundations of machine learning and so on, you can kind of see that these sort of the stone wall analogy, where the rocks are arranged to produce this wall, they're going to be different every time. And if you try and say, what's the higher level description of how did you put those rocks together to form this result, it would be, that will be different too. So it's kind of like if you say, how do you figure out the answer to this problem? Different people are going to do it differently, and that's not at all surprising. Now, how much commonality is there is an interesting question. I mean, we all see the same kind of optical illusions. We all have some of the same sort of psychological hacks work on all of us. We all have the same, there's certain human features which seem to be high level enough that they're fairly universal to humans. I mean, there are questions about, when we have language, sort of how universal are our attributes in terms of producing language. It's always hard to do that experiment because no human grew up in a vacuum, so to speak. Humans grow up in existing human society, and that's sort of a way in which kind of whatever was there before is transferred to the next generation. And so you can't really do kind of the clean experiment of if you had a human reared in a completely alien environment, would they kind of have the same attributes as humans that we know today? Okay, lots of great questions here. None of them are short. Thank you very much for the questions and for joining me. And I look forward to talking to you another time. Bye for now.